Yeah, what's this? StarCraft in my Hearthstone? That's right. We're getting Zerglings and lots of other Zerg and some Protos and Teran, all the StarCraft staples in the mini set here for the Great Dark Beyond. If you're a big StarCraft fan, this is going to be, I think, a big set for you. Some pretty spicy cards. We got some hero cards on the way for each of the faction leaders, you know, like a Kerrigan hero card, an Artanis hero card. That sounds pretty cool. None of those are out yet today. I think we'll see those revealed throughout the week, but we still got a bunch of very familiar StarCraft units to talk about here. And I guess we'll kick things off and explain how all this works with Zergling. So really, there's a couple things to look at here. We got to break down. So first, under the mana here is this banner that indicates this is a Zerg card, which is going to be relevant for like certain mechanics and like synergies. Basically, cards are going to reference Zerg cards, or like this will discount your Protoss cards or draw some Teran cards. And this banner is going to indicate that instead of like a minion type that might say Zerg or Protoss or Teran or whatever, because these could still be like mechs. Like Terrans are going to be both Teran and mech. So this is like a new little place to indicate that label and that synergy. Also, you'll note this little banner over here on the right with these three little dudes here. This is going to be on neutral cards to indicate that these are available to the Zerg classes, which here you'll see for Zerg, it's Death Knight, Demon Hunter, Hunter, and Warlock. So in other words, there will be actual class cards like Death Knight cards that are only playable in Death Knight. They won't have this banner. They'll still have the Zerg banner, but for neutral cards, this is both a Zerg and it is a multi-class card, kind of like what we had back in Mean Streets of Gadgetzan, which is just indicate here, but classes outside of these four cannot run the Zergling because they are not part of the Zerg faction. This is all, I know, a little bit confusing. Now, before we get into that card in detail, I wanted to also showcase here a Protoss card that's going to be available to Druid, Mage, Priest, and Rogue. And this one's kind of all about like big minions and cost discounts. And then finally, also we have Teran cards, which is going to be Paladin, Shaman, and Warrior. And these are all about starships, basically giving access to 3 classes here who otherwise did not have access to starships previously. So a bunch of like starship support. So there are going to be, as you can see here, like references to Protoss minions and Zerg minions. So the labels here are not just an indicator of the classes that can play them, but also they are going to be a relevant game mechanic as well, like a keyword of sorts, a tribe of sorts, the faction itself being referenced for like cost discounts and so on. So all that said, let's go ahead here and talk about the Zergling itself. And this is a 1-mana 1/1 Battlecry summon, a copy of this. So, you know, on a base level here, just a couple 1/1s on turn 1. We know historically that can be pretty great to just get those down. Although this doesn't have some of the upside of the other 1-cost token summoners. You know, like in Shaman, you've got, you know, a 1/1 that gives you a rush 1/1 and creates an 8/8 in hand. And in Hunter now, you've got like stealth 1/1s on that spell where you can make 2 stealth 1/1s. This doesn't do that, but it does have upside with buffs. It does summon a copy, not a base version. So if you like, you know, hand buff this, for instance, in Death Knight, you push this up to a 3/3 or something, it's going to summon a copy of a 3/3. So probably not relevant on turn 1, but if you do top deck this later or have some hand buffs or other buffs that are possible for your Zergling, then of course you can start to net additional benefit. Now, perhaps most important of all is the fact that this could be a big enabler for other Zerg style synergies. We're going to see some later in the video where you care about having Zerglings on board. For instance, the Hydralisk here, repeat for each other Zerg minion you control. So you can see here a deck that's like really leaning into a Zerg game plan. And probably a lot of these cards are going to force you to do that in a lot of ways. They have a lot of conditionality built on these factions. So this is like a great board builder to sometimes set up and enable those other Zerg cards. So I think, you know, solid at a baseline on turn 1. You're probably not mad to play this. Just get a couple 1/1s. Very important faction synergies here. Some additional upside with hand buff strategies as well. I don't know if that's enough in Death Knight. We haven't really seen hand buff take off big time in Death Knight, but in Hunter, certainly there might be some fun ways to play with that as well. So this card, in other words, looks like a really solid building block to me. I think good enough at a baseline with some additional hooks to build into. That's pretty promising. All right, so moving on over to the spawning pool. This is a neutral location, again, available to these 4 classes. Zerg, of course, get a 1/1 Zergling, which is this guy. And Death Rattle, your Zerg minions have rush this turn. So this is a cheap way to keep that Zerg engine going, keep swarming the board with little stuff, keep activating those synergies. And then that upside as well, when you do hit this that second time and this location dies, then that nice little rush bonus to give them some immediacy. You may not care too much about trading in your little Zerglings. Sometimes that might be nice in a pinch, but I imagine there'll be some bigger Zerglings where that's nice. I mean, we already saw a 4/2 Zergling here, where it's like, this has a nice battle cry. Maybe that 4/2 with rush like helps you clean up something left around on board on top of that. So this is just like really cheap and flexible, and I imagine you need to hit a critical mass if you're building a Zergling deck. So if any Zergling deck makes sense, you're probably going to have to run all of these cards just to make sure you have enough bodies to keep going down. So, you know, this feels kind of fundamental, much like the Zergling, I think, to a Zerg deck game plan. So given the fact that it has kind of 4 classes to work across, you have to imagine one of these finds something cool to do with that. You know, there is the risk that none of these cards are actually good enough to be played because they are so narrowly synergistic and sort of predefined in their deck package. That would suck. Like, you know, we have had that happen a few times recently in Hearthstone where the new cards just don't make much of an impact. And Great Dark Beyond has been a chief example of that, frankly, minus a few standout cards. There weren't a bunch of new decks that actually made waves in Great Dark Beyond. So hopefully that doesn't happen again with the mini set. I will say, you know, Zerg is probably lower risk to me perhaps than the other 2 we're going to look at, because this is just like more aggressive. You know, it probably can just get one deck that goes fast enough and gets under the meta that it works. I'm a little more worried about the Teran and Protos side of things, whether or not those will actually find competitive decks. But that basically means that I think Zergling and Spawning Pool are both just like fundamental pieces for this faction. So moving on over to Protos, we're going to take a look at our only Protoss neutral card of the day. This is Photon Cannon, a 2-mana spell. This is available again to Druid, Mage, Priest, and Rogue, and it says deal 3 damage. If this kills a minion, your Protoss minions cost 1 less this game. And it seems like Protoss are going to be about cheating out big minions and like cost reductions on Protoss cards. Now again, you know, this is very narrowly focused, leaning into Protoss minions specifically. Again, you're gonna have to build into all of the Protoss stuff probably if you want to make sure you have enough Protoss cards. We're unlikely to ever get Protoss cards again in the future because this is just like such a specific one-off bonus kind of theme for a set, right? I don't expect Protoss to come back at the end of the year or whatever. I mean, not impossible, I guess, but pretty unlikely, I think. So again, like if there's going to be a Protoss deck work, you have to imagine that's possible. Now, what we are going to see in this video are some Protoss Druid cards. We have the Carrier here, which you can see is a 12 cost minion. You'll note those cost discounts are going to be important, or Druid ramping past 10 mana, obviously. There's also the Construct Pylons. Are these Construct Pylons? Or is this a verb where you're constructing pylons? I don't know. Either way, the pylons is basically a prep for Protoss cards. Your next Protoss card costs 2 less. So you can see here, right, it's all about cheating out those higher cost things. And Carrier here, if you've read this, has a really big payoff. At the end of your turn, summon 4 4/1 interceptors that attack random enemies, which is just like crazy board development, potentially 16 damage to the face as well. That's not enemy minions, right? So you can see some of that coming together, but again, you need to lean into Protoss to make sure you have enough Protoss stuff. That said, Photon Cannon here seems like a busted effect when it happens, right? Like 2 mana, deal 3 damage. Do note that can also go face if you need to in a pinch. You probably want to hit minions, particularly in the early game, to start getting all those cost discounts on your Protoss cards. But if you need to, sitting in his face, hey man, that's a great backup plan. But often on turn 2, just kill something, get those discounts, start cheating out that bigger stuff, even medium-sized stuff. That feels like a very, very good effect. So I don't know if the kind of big heavy stuff works in most decks, because if you don't draw like your Photon Cannons or your cost discounts in time, are you going to be able to make all those things work? But in Druid, where you already have a ramp backup plan and you can kind of already get to high cost stuff anyway, that feels a bit like a match made in heaven, and you know, Druid can tend to break things anyway. So I could see this working really well in Druid, and then maybe a little shakier in the other classes, depending on perhaps, of course, what class cards they get, as we see throughout this week. But I think it's still a safer bet in Druid for sure, at the very least. All right, so moving on over to the Teran faction. Again, reminder, this is for Paladin, Shaman, and Warrior, giving them access to Starship stuff. And the Starport here you'll see is a new location, 2 mana, summon a 2/1 Starship piece with an effect when launched. And you'll see here, these are all different Teran units, I guess, from StarCraft. I know some of these. I don't remember the Liberator particularly well. But, you know, like Medevac Starship piece, when this is launched, summon 2/2 Marines with Taunt. Banshee, when this is launched, deal 5 damage to a random enemy. Raven, when this is launched, gain 3 random bonus effects. Those are kind of base keywords: Taunt, Rush, Lifesteal. When this is launched, deal 2 damage to all enemies. And Viking, when this is launched, gain 7 armor. So, I mean, those are all pretty interesting in their own ways. I would say I'm often the most disappointed by Raven. It could definitely have some high rolls. You know, if you get a big Starship with Rush and Lifesteal or something, that could be amazing sometimes. But, you know, 7 armor is a standout for sure. That's really cheap. Banshee can go face if needed. That could be pretty cool. Body off Medevac, etc. So some pretty nice little Starship pieces here. Do keep in mind, these don't actually do anything themselves, unlike, you know, many of the Starship pieces now that have like a death rattle or something that it's, you know, it's going off now. This bonus is only happening when it's launched. So these are kind of fuel, and in the meantime, just, you know, a little 2/1 that's sort of a throwaway, but mostly setting you up for that Starship. Now, we are going to see another card that gives you Starship pieces here with Liftoff, 3 mana spell, draw 2 Teran cards. Again, very narrow focus here. Going to be leaning hard into Teran stuff. Summon another 2/1 Starship piece with an effect. We're going to see Ghost. This card is crazy. We'll talk more about in a minute. Stealth, Battlecry, if you're building a Starship. So now some bonus cards if you're getting that Starship together. Destroy the lowest cost card in your opponent's hand. Silliness, particularly in Shaman with multiple Battlecries. Just wipe out your opponent's hand. Oh, and then we have SCV, which is probably the most important piece of all, right? 1 mana, 1/3 mech, Battlecry. Your next Starship launch costs 2 less, which that's really nice. You know, if you're getting all these little fodder Starship pieces, you don't want to be spending potentially too much on your Starship. You know, get multiple Starships per game and stuff like that. That's a great way to kind of accelerate that game plan a little bit. Also, another Battlecry here actually could be used in Shaman, I guess, to multiply these Battlecries. It may be too much, but, you know, at least stuff to work with there. So you can see here a little Starship package. We've also got some Shaman cards we can look at as well. It looks like the classes themselves are getting additional class Starship pieces, like the Missile Pod here for Shaman. Battlecry, deal 1 damage to all enemies, also triggers on launch. So that, you know, in combination with the other one that deals damage to all enemies, could like kind of wipe out a board. You've also got Lock On, set a minion's health to 1. Your next Starship launch costs 2 less. So this is already like 4 cost of discount in just a couple, you know, cards that each cost 1 mana. So you can really push those Starships out quickly. And then finally, Siege Tank, Battlecry, deal 10 damage to a random enemy. It transforms if you've launched a Starship into Siege Tank Deployed, which deals 10 damage to random enemy, and then excess damage hits the enemy hero. So that minion gets wiped out for more. You get some bonuses. So both class support and this little neutral package here to reward your Teran Starship, you know, commitment here, which Starships have been really iffy so far, right? Like really, really iffy. We saw some stuff in Rogue was kind of working, but beyond that, man, Starships have been hard to get off the ground, partly because of that cost commitment, partly because, you know, often you launch them and the opponent just like removes them so easily or deals with them so easily. I like this package a little better because it feels like it's lower commitment, both from a mana and like minion standpoint. Like you're not spending as much mana perhaps to get the Starships going. And then on top of that, you know, like maybe they aren't like as big or dangerous if the opponent just like removes it or steals it, right? Like you're not as punished to lose it or punished from a mana commitment or resource commitment standpoint. I also didn't even mention that the Starship is a mech, which you can see all these pieces are mechs, but the base Starship as well is a mech. So there are actually potentially some mech synergies that are possible here as well. You know, like magnetic, of course, any kind of like mech bonuses or buffs or whatever could play into this as well as an extra component. So looking at each of these cards more individually, Starport here, 2 mana location, you know, you do get a body immediately out of this. It's admittedly a pretty weak body, but perhaps an important one for your game plan. You know, some of these bonuses I think are pretty nice on the Starship when all things come together. So, you know, you get one on turn 2 and then another on turn 4, setting you up for a pretty nice Starship. You know, 2 mana is cheap, let's say, right? Like, that's not a huge commitment from a mana standpoint. Liftoff here, you know, this is draw 2 Teran cards, and if you're running a Teran package that is very focused into Starships, like, obviously you're gonna have other complementary cards in the deck, but just knowing they have a way to increase the reliability of your Starship stuff, your Starship payoffs, etc., that feels really good. So, like, great, like, base card draw on this that's also still getting you a little body. Again, you're not happy to get a 2/1 for 3, but, you know, a turn 2 starport, a turn 3 liftoff, activate your starport again on turn 4, maybe play something like a ghost on turn 4. That's a pretty good little line in the early game where you can see, like, okay, I've got, you know, basically a 2/1 every turn, so I'm doing a little bit on board. I got a nice little payoff on turn 4. Admittedly not the biggest, like, board advantage kind of card, but still you're doing something, getting a body down. And then, you know, maybe I've got a discounted Starship because of the SCV. Maybe that's already coming down on turn 4, frankly, because your SCV, or maybe still just turn 5, whatever the case. You can see a line coming together there, which I think there's some potential. Now, looking at Ghost, like, this card could be very frustrating, potentially. Battlecry, if you're building a Starship, destroy the lowest cost card in your opponent's hand. So just resource removal, which, you know, it is the lowest cost card, so sometimes you'll just be removing little fodder out of your opponent's hand they didn't really care too much about. Other times it could still be something key, or frankly in the mid game could still be something moderately sized because your opponent has maybe played out many of their smaller cards. And then there's ways to cheese this, like we said with Shaman, like multiplying these battle cries. You could actually get like 6 of these and just delete your opponent's entire hand or something. There's some absolute silliness possible. It's not available to Rogue, so don't worry about like Shadow Step necessarily, but kind of nice. You know, the 6/2 on this is an interesting stat line. Like, it does trade up pretty well in the mid game, or potentially just serve as a way to go face for 6. But I will say there's so much little AoE these days that 2 health does feel like a pretty big downside. Like, the stealth protects it against single target or trades, but there is plenty of little AoE that might still clean this up rather easily. So is the like resource denial going to be worth it, or will you care more about playing for board and making sure you don't fall too far behind in that side of things? It does feel like this deck could be a little bit more defensive. When you look at a lot of this, it feels like, you know, armor, board clear, Marines with taunt. Like, a lot of it does lean a little bit slower and a little bit more defensively, and this card's stat line is certainly one that's much more aggressive in nature. So will you be able to get enough like resource value out of this to make it worth it for the 4 mana cost, particularly if you're playing this on curve instead of saving it for later? Nah, maybe. And then the SCV here, this just looks really good to me. Like, you know, 1 mana, 1/3, good solid card to play down early. Just get a body down, clean up some 1/1s or whatever. Lots of those tend to hang around in the meta to wipe out some Zergs or something, right? And then the Starship launch is a huge discount, right? Solid body. Mech as well is relevant, of course, if you're leaning into those mech synergies, and the discounts here are just super, super relevant. So this looks like the kind of key card. You're going to feel probably very good when you have this one early, and maybe not feel so good when you don't. So moving on into the class cards now for a closer look. Let's start with this one Zerg card. We got the Hydralisk for Hunter. 4/2, Battlecry, deal 2 damage to random enemy. Repeat for each other Zerg minion you control. So this can go face, you know, and can clean up minions if there's a lot of those on board. If you have, you know, a handful of Zergs around, this is suddenly dealing, you know, maybe an extra 4, an extra 6, 8, you know, that's a lot of damage potentially. I will say it is kind of unreliable damage. You know, it's hard to sometimes math this out in a clean way, or, you know, oh no, they have a 6/6 on board and I hit it twice and 1 or 2 pings went to face. I don't really need that right now. It's like, oh man, that can feel a little bit clunky. And also, as soon as you fall behind and you don't have any Zergs and you have to start paying like an overhead on this to play Zergs the same turn, like, that's probably a problem too. Like, oh man, it's turn 5. I gotta play some Zergs down to make my Hydralisk kind of okay. And then it's just like by that stage it's fallen behind. So, you know, I think if you hit like Zergling early and play this on 3, like, yeah, potentially a really relevant board swing or just like some free face damage. As soon as you fall behind, though, man, this card seems to fall off really hard to me. I don't know. Like, it could be a face card later, potentially can hit face if you can wipe out the opponent's board or whatever. But a lot of the times, I think there's going to be weird, clunky math on this. And maybe a little bit too dependent on that board. You know, we'll see just how consistently Zerg can reload the board and how wide they can go. But I have concerns that this card is like really feast or famine, and that's going to create some limitations, I think. All right, so moving on over to the carrier. This is a 12 mana, 2/14 Mac, crazy stat line. At the end of your turn, summon 4/4/1 interceptors that attack random enemies. So, if you really squint, kind of similar to this card, right? Like, hey, I'm dealing damage to random stuff. But of course, the big difference is here, these are bodies that if, you know, if these goes face, they're sticking around, right? You're actually developing some pressure on board, and there's no conditionality on this. You don't have to have Protos on board. This just works. Now, notably, of course, it costs 12 mana. Like, that is clearly a big distinction. But with Druid and Protos discounts in particular, this is still a card I think you could see coming down on turn 5, on turn 6, or whatever. And that is going to be really swingy when that happens. These 4/1s are big enough that if they do hit in the mid game, still likely to take some pretty clean trades on stuff. And I think there will be a lot of instances too where this hits face for like 12 or 16 damage, and that is particularly crazy damage output. So whether you're just cheating this out via like normal Protoss stuff, could this even go in like a Dungar Druid package? It doesn't have taunt, importantly, which is bad for like Hydration Station, but might still be worth it. Like, is this better than Stargrazer in that slot for Great Dark Beyond? Sometimes, maybe. Also, that 14 health, if the opponent doesn't deal with this, it's an end of turn effect. It's happening again. Like, they got to actually solve this problem. That's not trivial to do at 14 health, particularly, you know, like an aggressive deck. Like, what, they don't have removal, they're just trading into this. Like, it's only got 2 damage, they might survive the trades, but still, man, it could really slow people down and just create an instant swing on board. So this is the kind of card to me that looks really scary in Druid specifically, despite the prohibitive cost. I think they'll find ways to work around that and make this card kind of great. And then, of course, the Construct Pylons or Construct Pylons, I still don't know. 0 mana Druid spell. Your next Protoss card this turn costs 2 less. I mean, yeah, that looks great, right? Like, we know preparation can be nuts. Literally, as long as Protoss works at all in Druid, this card will absolutely be an important part of that. Notably, you know, this does have that risk of failure. If Protoss doesn't work in Druid, obviously this card is garbage, because why would you run it if you're not running Protoss stuff? So, you know, like, it's very like all in, but I'm going to say, I think Druid, better than anybody else, has a chance to make this this faction work. And in that way, I think the Pylons card here will be pretty darn great. All right, so let's move on over to the Shaman Starship stuff. We got Missile Pod here, 2 mana, 1/3 mech Starship piece. Battle Cry, deal 1 damage to all enemies, and then that also triggers on launch. It's probably relevant to talk about Lock On in combination with this, because this sets a minion's health to 1. Which, you know, you could use Lock On and then use Missile Pod to clean that up. Kind of a one-tap quality consecration, at least on one guy anyway. So that's a nice little 1-2 punch. This also has that benefit of making your Starship cost less. So, you know, that's kind of cool. I don't think it's insane still, though. Like, you're going to be sitting on these all game waiting for that right thing to lock on. No, you're probably going to want to weave these in early to make sure you're, you know, kind of accelerating into your Starships, which means, are you using Lock On like a 3/3 very often, you know, just to Missile Pod it, or maybe just literally to play it, right? Probably, which does reduce some of the upside on Lock On. Maybe it's nice that it has some utility later, or like, you know, maybe as you launch your Starship, there's a more medium-sized thing. You use this, launch your Starship knowing that a Missile Pod's in there, so you kind of weave this one in earlier. There are some lines that feel decent there, I think, with those. I will note, though, too, that this does have some conditionality. So, like, if your opponent doesn't have anything to lock on, I'm assuming you can't use this, which means you can't get your discount, which means you might have to use it on your own thing, which means that could have some, like, mana interruptions where it's like, oh, God, I need to, like, totem first to use Lock On, but then I spent the 2 mana on the totem, you know, so there might be little moments like that where it's like, oh God, that's kind of frustrating, isn't it? So Missile Pod itself, you know, the battle cry here outside of Lock On is like, we got Zergling, we saw, you know, there's still pirates floating around in like Demon Hunter and Shaman and stuff, so there are board states where this does feel meaningful, but you know, the Starship pieces are often cards you want to play. You want to get them down, you want to get them rolling in the mix. You may not always have the right stuff lined up for this, so how often will this hit in a meaningful way versus how often will this just like, oh, okay, I pushed that 2-2 to 2-1. Yippee! You know, like, oh, okay, those 4-4s are all 4-3s now. Yippee! It may have moments where it just feels kind of meaningless, and then the same thing when the launch happens, like that 1 damage is not going to feel as relevant in the mix of a mid-game, late-game board or whatever. So you do wonder if that's going to feel impactful in mini scenarios. Again, I think a handful it'll feel fine. So it might just be one of those cards that's like, okay, I just kind of got this down and it didn't do much. And maybe it didn't feel like it committed enough. Now, 2 mana is cheap for Starship pieces. We've seen some in that like 3 mana, 4 mana range that feel harder to weave in. So that's an upside for this one. So some possibilities there, but still not the most compelling reason to do Starship stuff, I don't think, for either of these Shaman cards. Now, when we look at Siege Tank, this one's a little more interesting to me. 5 mana, 5/5 mech, deal 10 damage to a random enemy minion. At a base level, that's kind of cool. Like, obviously, you know, if your opponent has 1 big Titan out, and you're like, okay, man, Siege Tank was perfect. But there are so many board states these days that have little 2/2s and 3/3s and 1/1s floating around. Maybe you use Missile Pod to clean up the small stuff for your Siege Tank to remove the big thing. Again, that's considering some really ideal scenarios and math. I think more often this is going to feel hard to use, this 10/10. If it was just like split among all enemy minions, man, that could be pretty sick. So when you look at Siege Tank deployed, you're perhaps more interested because now, even if you had a 1/1, you're still getting some upside, right? Like, oh, I hit that 1/1. Well, now I get 9 damage to the enemy face thanks to the excess damage. So there is that side of it, but, you know, if you're behind and you need to play this for safety and maybe your Starship's not that compelling yet or not ready yet, you're probably not going to be very excited very often to play the base Siege Tank. So this is a card that's going to have to wait until those moments after the Starship gets launched the first time, which is notably cheaper and lower commitment in the past. And even then, I don't think Siege Tank is especially reliable in what you expect out of it. Is it a face damage card? Is it a removal card? It's somewhere in between and perhaps not good enough at either or reliable at either that it's still going to feel clunky from time to time. So ultimately, I guess I'll say, like, I don't think this Shaman stuff is that great of a reason for me so far to actually lean into a Shaman Starship deck. That said, the neutral stuff does have some interesting battle cry synergies that might be a nice combination with Shaman. So maybe the Shaman stuff just kind of gets run because you need that Teran package. You need enough Teran cards to make it worth it. And these are just kind of freebies that you toss in the deck list that do have, you know, some additional battle cry upsides for perhaps a battle cry based deck. So not compelling in and of themselves, but maybe as a package, they do get a bit of a boost. Don't be alarmed. This is an old card. So all of that said, let's go ahead and rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Zergling is a 4-star card. Spawning Pool is a 4-star card. Photon Cannon is a 4-star card. Starport is a 3-star card. Liftoff is a 4-star card. Ghost is a 3-star card. SCV is a 4-star card. Hydralisk is a 2-star card. Carrier is a 5-star card. Construct Pylons is a 4-star card. Missile Pod is a 3-star card. Lock On is a 3-star card. Siege Tank is a 3-star card. And there you go. Those are the first cards from the StarCraft mini-set. Interesting stuff. I'll say, like, I'm frankly not a fan of mixing in StarCraft into Hearthstone. I'll say it. I'm brave enough to say it. Yeah, I'll say it. I wasn't really a fan of Diablo either, but I could kind of, you know, look the other way with that one because it's like, it's still kind of medieval fantasy. Like, yeah, there's demons. And yes, there are spaceships in, you know, in Hearthstone. We had Great Dark Beyond. Obviously, I understand the connection, but this is definitely more of a, you know, modern advanced sci-fi that to me doesn't really fit quite as well with the Hearthstone aesthetic. I could probably be fine with Zergling, but in particular, like Teran, yeah, I don't know. It just looks a little too industrial, modern, you know, Earth sci-fi for me. But who cares, right? Like, you know, if people enjoy it, if people love StarCraft, if it brings back nostalgia, who cares? I'll get over it, certainly. Still mostly excited for just like new cards and new ideas and stuff. So anyway, we'll make the most of it. That said, curious about your thoughts for the StarCraft mini set, these cards, what's going to be busted, what's not. Share all that down below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned this week as we see more and more StarCraft cards.